What are some events in recorded history that are extremely hard to believe? For example, Halley's Comet appeared in the sky when Mark Twain was born in 1835. The comet moves in a 75 or 76-year orbit. And, as it neared Earth once again, Twain said, "I came in with Halley's Comet, and I expect to go out with it." Sure enough, he died on April 21, 1910, just as the comet made its next pass with inside of Earth. The story of Desmond Doss, if you've seen Hacksaw Ridge, that tells it, but they tell the watered-down version for the movie because they didn't think anyone would believe it with all the full details. The basics of the story are basically, he was left behind on a cliff with a lot of men who were wounded when the US had to pull out in World War II. He then single-handedly carried 75 men off that cliff and lowered them down to men below to be rescued. He was the first conscientious objector to win the Medal of Honor for what he did. But he was also malnourished because of his religious beliefs. He couldn't eat some of the food he was given, so he's this very thin guy managing to lift and carry 75 men in one night and then lower them down a cliff. And the movie showed the next day he knocked away a grenade and was injured. But he was more injured than they showed, with 17 pieces of shrapnel in his body, and he literally got off the stretcher when waiting to be brought down for someone more injured than he was, and was providing medical care to that guy as he had been blasted. When Abraham Lincoln was still a state legislator in Illinois, he got into a public feud with a rival politician named James Shields that culminated in Shields challenging Lincoln to a duel. As the challenged party, Lincoln was given the choice of weapons for the duel. Shields assumed he would choose pistols. Lincoln chose broadswords. When they arrived at the duel site and were getting ready, Lincoln demonstrated his significant height and reach advantage over Shields by swinging his sword over his head and cutting a tree branch clean off. Shields then realized he'd made a huge mistake and immediately conceded.
Even crazier, some of the Japanese soldiers in the battle claimed to have had him in their sights multiple times, and every time they tried to shoot him, their gun jammed. Check out the 2004 documentary, The Conscientious Objector.
The raising of Chicago sounds completely made up. In the 1850s, Chicago kept flooding, so they went around block by block and lifted the entire city by approximately 6 to 14 feet using nothing but human-powered jack screws. Streets were filled in and raised to meet the new elevation. A handful of buildings didn't get raised and now have the ground floor on what was once the second floor. Pullman, the rail car company, got their start in this industry and only shifted to rail car manufacturing once they ran out of buildings to raise. Everyone talks about the 1800s engineering insanity of reversing the river so that it flowed into the Mississippi instead of Lake Michigan, but the raising is rarely mentioned, I think because it's so unbelievable. During the First World War, the German ship Cap Trafalgar was made to look like a British ship, the HMS Carmania, with the goal to lure British ships in close before attacking them. The first ship the HMS Carmania ran into was the actual HMS Carmania. The real HMS Carmania was damaged, but the Cap Trafalgar was sunk. In 1920, President Paul Deschanel of France fell through the window of the train while traveling on the Orient Express. He stumbled up to the nearest signal box in his pajamas and told the signalman that he needed help and that he was the president of France. The signalman reportedly replied, "And I'm Napoleon Bonaparte."
Was he really Napoleon Bonaparte? Don't end the story with a cliffhanger.
The Great Arizona Irhan Abduction. Basically, Catholic nuns brought Irish orphans to Arizona to put them in good upstanding Catholic families. Most of the Catholic families in Arizona were Mexican. White people see white children being placed in Mexican households, so they form a vigilante group to kidnap the children. It was a giant fustercluck. The Archduke's car stalling right in front of his would be assassin having a sandwich. Dude wasn't even trying to kill him anymore. It was just a right place, right time coincidence. Abraham Lincoln's eldest son was saved from death or at least serious injury on a train platform by a famous actor named Booth. Roughly a year, Booth's brother John Wilkes Booth would go on to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. The Dancing Plague of 1518. In the small town of Strasbourg, France, a mysterious phenomenon gripped its inhabitants in the summer of 1518. Over 400 people became afflicted with an uncontrollable urge to dance, leading to exhaustion, injury, and even death. Penicillin was discovered by accident. A man leaving bacteria cultures exposed to air. They got moldy, killed the bacteria. Whoops, I just discovered something that will save millions of lives.
And it was all because he was lazy and didn't want to toss it.
That somehow the Sentinelese people managed to stay mostly out of contact with civilization while being so damn close to India and not that geographically isolated. All with spears and arrows and hostility. During the peak of European colonialism, the Europeans usually had no problem forcing their way in with cannon and swords and would take the hits. The Sentinelese were just lucky that their island was relatively small and uninteresting. And somehow they resisted the Indian empires as well.
Indian empires are famous for rarely invading outside of the subcontinent and almost never had a great navy. Cholas were probably the only Indian empire to campaign in the general direction of North Sentinel Island. Adding to the fact that the place has been historically so unproductive, remote and strategically unimportant. The island is over 1,000 km from India and 500 kilometers from Indochina. It's not unbelievable that Sentinelese were just left alone.
Interestingly, the theory behind the hostility is that Colons actually kidnapped a bunch of their kids and returned them later on. They likely disclosed the abuse they suffered, and that info was passed on. If you see people coming on a boat, kill them.
For decades, Canada and Denmark fought a war over an island in the Arctic Ocean, Hans Island, by planting their respective flags and taking crates of liquor the other country's soldiers left behind for them. The Whiskey War finally ended in 2022 when the two countries decided to split the island in half, with Canada controlling the western part and Denmark controlling the eastern part. That our knowledge of the civilizations north of Rome are mostly defined by Caesar himself and a political diatribe to reinforce his standing. The entire world of massive civilizations are a giant question mark. The areas around the Fertile Crescent became dry and parched and uninhabitable, preserving the clay tablets and so forth. The areas north of Rome warmed into the greatest forest in human history, inhabited by myriad different civilizations that are truly just lost to time. The areas around recorded history are what fascinates me. Thank God for Pliny.
When I studied ancient history at university, it seems there was a climatic shift of some importance around 2000 BC. Indus Valley culture seemed to die away and Old Kingdom Egypt collapsed.
The Alaska quake of 1964. It lasted over 5 minutes. As someone who grew up in California and experienced many quakes, including the one in 1989 San Francisco, which was 15 seconds, so a 5-minute quake is insane.
That made me think of the 1958 Alaska earthquake, which generated the highest ever tsunami in recorded history in Lichia Bay. At 1,720 feet was the height of the Empire State Building and Statue of Liberty put together.
Hitler went from a broke, wounded soldier to absolute dictator of Germany in only 15 years, 9 months of which he spent in prison. That's
And
a
the
Faustian
rings
pact
of
right
Saturn.
there. Sharks have been around longer than trees. During World War II, the Americans planned to burn down Japanese cities using bats with explosive backpacks. The atomic bomb was developed before the bats could be sent in, but they probably would have worked startlingly well. Hitler, Stalin, Tito, Trotsky, Lenin, Archduke Ferdinand, and Freud all lived near each other in Vienna in 1913. It's likely they also drank coffee at Central Café, a popular place for intellectuals and politicians.
Maybe there was something in the water there.
The tale of Mike the Durable Malloy. He was also nicknamed the Irish Rasputin for reasons that will soon become clear. An out-of-work firefighter turned alcoholic during the Great Depression becomes a regular at a speakeasy owned by a shady bunch of crooks. They figured nobody would miss him much if he died, so they hatch a plan, get him to drunkenly take out a life insurance policy in their name and let him drink himself to death. So they give him an unlimited bar tab and the strongest stuff they've got in stock. Despite drinking all day, he's handling it just fine. So they start putting antifreeze and pure methanol in his drinks, trying to poison him. It still doesn't kill him, so they throw in rat poison, horse liniment, turpentine, anything they can think of that'd send you straight to hospital if you ingested it. Does that bother OL Iron Mike? No sir, he just comes back the next day and orders more drinks. So they give him food too, raw oysters soaked in whiskey and sandwiches laced with rat poison and carpet tacks. Not only does Mike Malloy scoff the lot, but he leaves that night and comes back the next morning complaining he had nothing more than a bit of an upset stomach. By this point, the gang are getting desperate. Clearly nothing they feed him is going to do any damage, no matter how poisonous. So they get him blackout drunk, strip him naked, and leave him in the middle of the park, soaked in water. And being the middle of winter, dying of hypothermia seemed like a sure thing. Does he die? Does he ever? He turns up happily the next morning and orders more drinks, none the wiser. By now the gang don't care how they do it, they just want to kill this impervious bastard however they can. After he leaves for the night, one of them runs him over in their car, breaking his bones and sending him to the hospital. 3 weeks later, Mike Malloy leaves the hospital, still alive. The gang still haven't got their hands on any money. Finally, after Malloy passed out drunk in their bar yet again, they take him to an apartment, hook a hose up to the gas main, and stick it in his mouth. After all that effort, carbon monoxide poisoning is what finally does Mike Malloy in. Of course, by this point the legend of Michael Malloy has spread around town, and once the police hear that he's died, they dig him up to examine the body. The Murder Trust, as the press end up naming them, are quickly rounded up. They get nothing except a short trip to the electric chair. Alas, Mike was indeed killed in the end, but if he rose from his grave and wandered into a nearby bar to order a few rounds ... it wouldn't surprise me all that much. (1903) First manned flight. 1969 we landed on the moon. This is still insane to me. These events are recorded in the physical record of the universe, so I think they count. There is new evidence that sharks may be older than the rings of Saturn. New estimates of their formation overlap with some of the earliest fossil records of sharks. The Appalachian Mountains were already old and eroding when the rings of Saturn were formed. When animals first stepped into land from the ocean, they were ancient and crumbling. They and the Scottish Highlands are part of the same mountain chain, since they have existed since before the continents separated from Pangaea to go their own ways.
There are no fossils in the Appalachian Mountains because the Appalachian Mountains are older than bones. Blows my freaking mind.
This guy really loves the rings of Saturn.
Hannibal marching elephants to Rome is pretty unbelievable. And then getting his elephants owned by flaming pigs just adds to the craziness.
Only one elephant reached Rome, to be fair. Most died in the Alps. The crossing of the Alps left thousands of soldiers dead, a fact which many people ignore.
Wouldn't be the last time something like this happened.
When Timur marched on India, the Indians sent an army against him. They included 120 war elephants.
And Frank, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Barbara Walters were all born in 1929.
Jimmy Carter was born in 1924. While he's on his way out, it's so crazy to think that he's older than them.
In 1944, 9 U.S. airmen were shot down over a Japanese island and 8 were captured, executed, and eaten by starving Japanese troops. This is now known as the Chichijima Incident. 44 years later, the 9th Airman that evaded capture was elected president.
I knew Bush was shot down, but that's all they ever really say about it. I see why now.
The papal election of 1159 was absolute madness. Out of a total of 30 cardinals, 27 voted for Roland of Siena and the remaining 3 supported Cardinal Octavian, who had known sympathies with the German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. As Roland of Siena, hereafter known as Pope Alexander III, was being presented with the papal mantle, Octavian, hereafter known as Pope Victor IV, went into a rage and snatched the papal mantle off Alexander's back. One of the people present snatched the mantle from him. One of Victor IV's chaplains snatched it back. Then Victor IV put it on and demanded to be crowned pope. The crowd then proceeded to break into hysterical laughter because he put it on backwards. It was at this point that a band of armed men burst into the church of St. Peter and chased everyone out. Then Victor's supporters declared him to be the new pope. Alexander fled to the Basilica of St. Peter, and HIS people declared him the new pope. Both of them excommunicated each other, and they both declared each other antipopes. To make things more complicated, then Victor IV died, and his successor, Pope Paschal III, kept up the fight and was also declared an antipope. All this nonsense continued until Barbarossa was defeated at the Battle of Legnano, and Alexander III was officially declared pope. Your grandma was hot enough to bang at one point.
Still is.
The fact that after the entire world made hullabaloo of Holocaust, pretending like they have learnt the lesson, and a genocide will never occur again, the fact a genocide is being live-streamed, and yet it's an acceptable thing. Close to 1 million people in Armenia were displaced, and yet it barely made any news because the powerful countries decide it is okay. The fact that despite having a level of wealth resources, technology, and prosperity which has never been seen, we've people struggling with hunger. Not in recorded history, but it'll be in history 20 years later.
The whole world at the time watched the Rwandan genocide happen, and no one did anything.
Growing up on Okinawa was wild because the remnants of that war are found all over. It was not uncommon to find bullet casings and shotgun shells along with shrapnel buried in the woods. I can't imagine what either side went through. That island is so tiny for that many people to be fighting on it. When Greece got its independence from the Ottoman Empire and sent soldiers to its more remote islands, they told the people living there that they were free now and could be Greeks again. The people replied, "But we are Roman." The Ottomans had never put a presence on the islands, so the people still believed themselves to be part of the Byzantine, Eastern Roman Empire, 600 years after it fell. The Dutch tulip bubble. For a few years in the 1600s, people were paying the equivalent of $500,000 for a single tulip bulb.
Still a better idea than NFTs.
Rasputin's death.
It's a great story, but most of it was made up by his killers to conceal their startling incompetence. Shot him, missed. Poisoned him, chickened out and didn't add the poison. Stabbed him, missed anything vital. Chained him up badly and threw him in the river. Finally killed him because he was too injured to get out on his own.
The Ottoman Empire lasted over 600 years.
It was founded in 1299, and yet there's still people born in the Ottoman Empire that are alive today.
Toronto clown riots of 1855. Clowns went to the brothel at the end of their show, and the clowns didn't get along with the firefighters. The police refused to get involved, and it resulted in the entire police force being fired. The Holocaust and the Holodomor. It's hard to understand that there were actually humans willing to do that to other humans. To clarify, I'm not doubting it. I just mean it's hard to believe people would actually do things like that on such a scale.
I can't remember where I read it, but it really stuck with me. Someone wrote that the real lesson of history is that evil people do evil things, because we expect that. The real lesson is that good people will do evil things believing they are doing something good.
The Challenger explosion. Krista McAuliffe won a contest to be the first teacher in space. Schools all over the country wheeled televisions into classrooms to watch the launch, only for the shuttle to explode. In 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld a state statute allowing institutions to forcibly sterilize intellectually disabled persons. The case was brought by a Dr. Pretty of Virginia, who had already performed hundreds of forced sterilizations on immoral and promiscuous women. The year 1816 had no summer. This was because of reduced global temperatures due to a massive volcanic explosion in Indonesia in 1815. The explosion was so huge that nearly half of the mountain was blown away, and the ash spread to a radius of more than 1,300 kilometers.
And this led to a rowdy party of intellectuals having to stay indoors and challenge each other to invent ghost stories due to the cold and rainy weather, which resulted in the novel Frankenstein, written by an 18-year-old Mary Shelley, and the vampire.
Pol Pot in Cambodia, in modern times, AFT or World War II, had 2 million of his own people killed and still remained alive after Vietnam rescued the people of Cambodia from him. He was never punished. It's also unbelievable that any form or style of dictator would kill all of its educated people and adults. It's just bizarre.
He used anti-intellectualism to assert his authority mainly. Basically, by killing all the smart people, he thought people wouldn't be able to figure out ways of dissent or of going against his regime. It also acted as a form of control as it showed civilians that he wasn't ducking around.
That Jesus had superpowers and could heal people, and nothing since has ever happened again.
The key is that you're not allowed to question the premise of it, LOL.